Walter's voice cut through the tense silence. "A mix-up?" he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "Or was it a choice?" The first-class cabin was dead silent now. The businessman 2 rows ahead shifted uncomfortably. The woman across the aisle clutched her mimosa, her knuckles white. Caroline swallowed hard. She knew the answer. They all did. Before she could stammer out another excuse, the intercom crackled. "Miss Miller, report to the cockpit immediately." The blood drained from her face. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering. She turned stiffly, her legs heavy as she made the humiliating walk toward the front. 2 minutes later she emerged, her face pale. All eyes were on her. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Jennings," she forced a tight-lipped smile, "I'd like to escort you back to first class." Walter didn't move. He simply studied her, letting the moment stretch. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stood, and as he walked back to his rightful seat, the weight of justice followed every step. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Comment below. And if you love stories about justice being served, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. Walter Jennings walked through the bustling Miami International Airport, his polished leather shoes tapping steadily against the gleaming tile floor. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent decades commanding a lecture hall, his presence understated yet impossible to ignore. At 76, he had seen the world change in ways both remarkable and disheartening, but today, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of lightness, of anticipation. His grandson, a corporate executive at one of the country's largest airlines, had surprised him with a first-class ticket to Los Angeles. The reason? A moment Walter had been waiting for his entire life, the chance to meet his newborn great-grandson. As he approached the gate, he reached into the pocket of his tailored navy suit, pulling out the pristine boarding pass. He ran his fingers over it, the smooth paper oddly symbolic. A simple slip of paper, yet one that held weight beyond just his seat assignment. If only dignity could be carried this effortlessly. If only a lifetime of proving oneself didn't require more than a mere ticket. The boarding process moved swiftly, and when Walter stepped onto the jet bridge, the familiar scent of recirculated cabin air greeted him. He moved with quiet confidence, nodding politely to the flight attendants at the entrance. His voice, rich with the wisdom of years, carried warmth as he greeted them. "Good afternoon," he said, adjusting the strap of his leather carry-on bag over his shoulder. A younger flight attendant returned his greeting with a practiced yet genuine smile, gesturing toward the first-class cabin. Walter walked through, taking in the soft hum of conversation, the rhythmic tapping of fingers on laptop keyboards, the clinking of ice against glass as a passenger swirled their drink. He reached row 3, spotting his assigned seat. 3A. A window seat with ample space, plush cushions, and the promise of a comfortable journey. He lowered himself with the deliberate movements of a man who refused to let age define him, exhaling as he adjusted his reading glasses and reached into his bag for the well-worn book he had been rereading for the 4th time. As he flipped through the pages, savoring the moment of solitude before takeoff, a subtle shift in the air sent a ripple through the first-class cabin. Caroline Miller, a senior flight attendant with a sharp gaze and a reputation for maintaining strict order, entered with the air of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her navy uniform was pressed to perfection, her posture a picture of authority. She moved through the aisle with mechanical precision, offering tight smiles to passengers as she scanned the cabin. But then, she stopped. Her practiced professionalism faltered for just a fraction of a second. Her gaze landed on Walter. Something in her eyes flickered. Hesitation, doubt, an unspoken question forming in the back of her mind. Her fingers curled slightly around the tablet she held, her jaw tightening ever so subtly. To the untrained eye, it was a moment so small it could have been dismissed as nothing. But Walter had seen these moments before. He had felt them in boardrooms and restaurants, in places where his presence was met with a pause, a second glance, an unspoken evaluation of whether he truly belonged. And in that instant, he knew this flight was about to become more than just a trip to meet his great-grandson. Caroline hesitated, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the flicker of doubt crossing her face. Her smile, which had been automatic and easy as she greeted other first-class passengers, tightened at the corners. She glanced around quickly, as if searching for confirmation that something was out of place. The cabin was filled with the usual first-class crowd: well-dressed businessmen, young tech executives, a few older white couples sipping pre-flight champagne. Everything looked as it should, everything except him. Her grip on the tablet in her hands shifted, fingers tightening ever so slightly against the smooth surface. The way her eyes scanned Walter wasn't overt, but it was measured, a quiet assessment that was far too familiar to him. He had seen it before. In department stores, when sales associates subtly redirected him to a different section. In restaurants, when hosts pretended not to see him standing in line. In board meetings, when his colleagues had once questioned his credentials, despite the fact that he had written the reports they were discussing. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was controlled but laced with something just beneath the surface, something unspoken but clear enough. "Excuse me, sir. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" It wasn't outright hostile. It wasn't even overtly accusatory. But it was enough. Walter lifted his eyes from the book resting in his lap, his fingers still gently curled around the worn pages. He studied her for a moment, not with anger, not with immediate protest, but with the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime deciding when to engage and when to let silence say more. He had learned that the pause before his response was often more powerful than the words themselves. He let the moment stretch, watching as Caroline's fingers twitched against the tablet, as a few nearby passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen, but very much aware of the tension creeping into the air. Walter let out a slow breath before speaking, his voice even, measured. "Yes, I'm quite sure," he said, the words carrying a weight that went beyond their simplicity. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, moving without urgency, and pulled out his neatly folded boarding pass. Without breaking eye contact, he extended it toward her, his hand steady, unwavering. Caroline took it, her jaw tightening just a fraction as she scanned the details. First class. Seat 3A, paid in full. Her lips pressed together into a thin line, her eyes flicking between the ticket and the man sitting before her. Walter watched as she processed what she was seeing, as she tried to find an explanation that made sense to her. She blinked once, then twice, as if the simple fact of his presence didn't quite compute. He could see it in the slight furrow of her brow, the hesitation that hadn't been there when she greeted the man across the aisle or the woman 2 rows ahead. The realization of what was happening settled deep in Walter's chest, familiar and heavy. It was always the same pause, the same doubt, the same unspoken question. Does he really belong here? Caroline took the ticket with a tight-lipped smile, her fingers pressing into the thin slip of paper as if she could find something on it that would justify her doubt. She scanned it once, then again, flipping it over as though she expected to see something, anything, that would prove she wasn't wrong about this. But the details were clear. First class, seat 3A. Walter Jennings. A fully paid ticket, no signs of error, no reason for him not to be sitting exactly where he was, yet something in her still refused to let it go. "There must be a mistake," she said, finally, lifting her eyes from the ticket, her voice edged with authority, as if simply stating it would make it true. Walter held her gaze, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that had been sharpened by years of these moments, by decades of forced patience. He had been here before. Not here exactly, not on a plane, not in this seat, but in spaces where people like her looked at people like him and assumed something wasn't right. Assumed his presence was a clerical error, an oversight, something that needed to be corrected. "No mistake, ma'am," he said smoothly, his voice carrying no hostility, only certainty. "My grandson got it for me." A shift in the air. Passengers nearby, previously lost in their phones, their drinks, their conversations, began to take notice. A businessman 2 rows ahead glanced over the top of his tablet, his eyes flickering between Caroline and Walter. A woman across the aisle, mid-sip of her mimosa, hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before setting her glass back down on the tray table. The quiet hum of the first-class cabin remained, but there was an underlying tension now, a subtle but undeniable change in the energy of the space. Caroline didn't acknowledge the shift. She was too busy forcing a polite but strained smile, gripping the ticket a little too tightly as she exhaled through her nose. "I just need to check something," she said, her tone breezy, dismissive as though this was nothing at all. "Just routine, just a small verification before everything could return to normal." She turned abruptly, already moving toward the front of the cabin, ticket still in hand. Walter watched her go, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He had thought, perhaps foolishly, that things like this might have changed, that at least here, in this moment, his presence wouldn't require proof. But he was wrong. He could feel the eyes on him now, some watching openly, others pretending not to look while stealing quick glances. The weight of their silence pressed against him, familiar, suffocating. He shifted in his seat, adjusting the crease of his blazer with deliberate care, and let out a slow breath. He wouldn't let this ruin his trip. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of rattling him. From the front of the cabin, Caroline stood stiffly at the service station, her brows furrowed as she tapped at the screen on her tablet, checking for something that would confirm what she already believed to be true. Because it didn't make sense. It didn't fit. He didn't fit. The polished suit, the carefully folded pocket square, the effortless poise, none of it matched the image in her mind of the people who sat in first class. Her colleague, a younger flight attendant, passed by and raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" Caroline hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "Yeah," she said finally, but her tone was clipped. "I just need to check something." Her fingers hovered over the screen again before she finally exhaled sharply and turned back toward the cabin, her decision made. It wasn't about what was on the screen, it was about what she had already decided. Walter saw her approaching before she even spoke, and before she opened her mouth, he knew exactly what was coming. "Sir," she said, forcing another thin-lipped smile, "I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy. There seems to be a mix-up with your ticket." The silence in the cabin stretched. Walter remained still, his face unreadable, his hands resting lightly on his lap. He let the words settle in the space between them, let them hang in the air like a challenge. "A mix-up?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. Caroline nodded, her voice firmer now, as if doubling down would erase the uncertainty creeping at the edges of her confidence. "Yes. This seat is for first-class passengers. It looks like you've been assigned a different section." Another shift. A ripple of unease moved through the cabin, barely perceptible, but there. The businessman with the tablet shifted in his seat. The woman with the mimosa glanced down at her drink, suddenly very interested in the bubbles rising to the surface. Walter's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "There is no mistake," he said, and this time there was an edge beneath the calm. A quiet, powerful defiance. Caroline folded her arms. "Sir, I don't want to make this difficult." Walter didn't move. He didn't argue. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a message. He hit send. Then, without another word, he picked up his bag, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and stood. What Caroline didn't know was that message had just changed everything. Caroline's fingers curled slightly around the boarding pass as she walked briskly toward the galley, her mind racing. Something about this didn't sit right. She didn't know what exactly, but it didn't. And she wasn't about to ignore her instincts. Stopping just inside the service station, she spotted Mark, a younger flight attendant who had been with the airline for about 2 years. He was in the middle of stacking beverage trays, but when he saw the look on her face, he straightened slightly, curiosity flickering across his features. She lowered her voice, glancing over her shoulder before holding up the ticket between them. "It's a first-class seat, but are we sure?" Mark blinked, his brows drawing together in confusion. "Are we sure about what?" Caroline hesitated, struggling to articulate what she was thinking without outright saying it. She huffed, flipping the ticket toward him. "Just look at this. Check it." Mark took the ticket and gave it a once-overs, his expression neutral as he scanned the details. He flipped it, checked the name, the seat assignment. Finally, after an extra second of scrutiny, he shrugged. "Looks fine to me." Caroline's jaw tightened. That wasn't the answer she was looking for. "Did you check it in the system?" she pressed. Mark hesitated, now looking at her a little closer, like he was starting to understand what she was really asking. "I mean, it's printed. It's valid. Why would I need to—" Caroline exhaled sharply, looking past him as if searching for a reason that would make sense. I don't know, I've never seen him in first class before." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Caroline hesitated again, aware that she was towing a dangerous line. "I mean, I know most of our first-class regulars," she said carefully. "I don't recognize him." Mark's expression didn't change, but there was something in the way his shoulders squared that made it clear he was hearing exactly what she wasn't saying. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, before handing the ticket back to her. "Well, now you do." Caroline's lips pressed together, a flicker of frustration sparking in her chest. She turned away before he could say anything else, gripping the ticket like it was evidence of something she still hadn't figured out. Back in the first-class cabin, Walter had settled into his new seat in economy, his body calm, his face unreadable, but his mind was anything but. He had been through too much in his life to be surprised, but disappointment never got easier. He exhaled through his nose, feeling the tightness in his chest, the quiet, simmering anger curling in his stomach, not at just this moment, but at the weight of a lifetime of moments just like this one. A soft ping vibrated in his pocket. He pulled out his phone and glanced at the reply. One message. "Who asked you to move?" Walter's fingers hovered over the screen for only a second before typing his response. "Flight attendant. Blonde woman. Didn't check properly, just assumed." There was a long pause before another message appeared. "What's the flight number?" Walter glanced at his boarding pass, typed out the details, and hit send. He didn't know what was about to happen next. But something in his gut told him this wasn't over, not even close. Caroline squared her shoulders, gripping the boarding pass a little too tightly as she stepped back into the first-class cabin. The tension in her chest hadn't eased, even after her brief conversation with Mark. If anything, it had tightened. She knew what she saw, what she felt, and no perfectly printed ticket was going to override her instincts. Approaching Walter's former seat, she barely glanced at the businessman who had taken his place, now stretching out comfortably, adjusting his watch like nothing had happened. She turned toward the back of the plane, scanning the economy section until she found Walter sitting near the window, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. For a moment she hesitated. Something about the way he sat there, still and composed, made her chest tighten, but she pushed the feeling aside. Clearing her throat, she stepped forward. "Sir," she said, her voice firmer now, more authoritative, "I'm going to have to ask you to move back to first class." Walter didn't move. He didn't even look at her right away. He simply continued staring out the window, his hands resting lightly on his lap. The moments stretched, silent and heavy. A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, their conversations tapering off as they began to take notice. The woman in the aisle seat beside him stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around the paperback novel in her lap. Across the row, a man with noise-canceling headphones pulled one ear up away, pretending to adjust it but clearly listening. Caroline's forced smile faltered slightly, the weight of the attention pressing in on her. "Sir," she repeated, louder this time, "there's been a mix-up. You need to return to your original seat." Walter turned then, slowly, deliberately, his gaze meeting hers with quiet intensity. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, unwavering. "A mix-up?" Caroline nodded quickly, clinging to the script in her head. "Yes, there was an error with your seating assignment. You are supposed to be in first class." Walter let the words hang between them for a moment before speaking again. "Was it a mix-up?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Or was it a choice?" The murmur in the cabin grew. Passengers exchanged glances, some leaning in slightly, their curiosity piqued. A businessman 2 rows back shifted in his seat, pretending to stretch but clearly paying attention. The woman across the aisle pressed her lips together, watching closely. Caroline's chest tightened, but she kept her tone level. "Sir, I'm asking you to come with me so we can correct this." Walter didn't move. He didn't argue. He simply stared at her for a long, silent beat before exhaling softly and rising from his seat with an ease that didn't match the tension in the air. Without another word, he reached down, lifted his bag, and stepped into the aisle. But this time the walk back wasn't quiet. Passengers who had been silent before now followed him with their eyes, their expressions ranging from unease to shame to something else, something unspoken but understood. They had all seen what happened earlier. They had all watched him be dismissed from his seat, watched as Caroline barely looked at his ticket before sending him to the back of the plane. And now, watching him return with slow, deliberate steps, the reality of what had happened settled over them like a suffocating weight. Caroline felt it too, the shift, the judgment, the recognition flickering behind people's eyes, some avoiding her gaze, others watching her too closely. A man in first class cleared his throat, awkwardly adjusting his tie. The woman with the mimosa sat stiffly, her hands wrapped around the stem of her glass as if she suddenly wasn't sure whether to take another sip. Walter moved with purpose, his back straight, his shoulders squared as he passed the rows of passengers. He didn't rush, he didn't shuffle, he didn't shrink himself to make others more comfortable, and somehow that made the moment even heavier. Caroline followed behind him, her face warm, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had done this walk 1,000 times before, moving through the aisle with the confidence of someone in control. But now, every step felt heavier, like the weight of what she had done was pressing down with each movement. When Walter finally reached his original seat, he didn't sit right away. He turned slightly, meeting her eyes once more, his expression unreadable. "If you're going to apologize," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharp, "be honest about why." A few passengers let out quiet gasps. The ones who had pretended not to see what happened earlier suddenly felt exposed. Caroline swallowed hard, but the words wouldn't come, because she knew, they all knew, that this had never been a mix-up. Walter adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder, his movements steady, deliberate. He wouldn't argue, he wouldn't raise his voice, he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing frustration or anger because he knew it too well, that people like her expected a reaction, expected resistance so they could twist the story in their favor. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of grace under pressure, of knowing when to fight and when to let the world convict itself. This moment was no different. He turned, his back straight, his chin lifted ever so slightly, and he started walking. The first few steps were heavy, not from the weight of his bag, but from the weight of something deeper, something older than this flight, older than him. He walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but with purpose, as though every measured step was a statement of its own. His polished shoes barely made a sound against the carpeted floor, yet the silence that followed him was deafening. His hand slipped into his pocket as he neared the dividing curtain between first class and economy. His fingers brushed against the smooth surface of his phone, and without breaking his stride, he typed a brief message. 3 words. Then he hit send. A shift. Subtle at first, like a ripple disturbing still water, but undeniable. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with something just beneath the surface. It wasn't just the passengers who had been watching him earlier, sneaking glances, whispering behind their hands. It was everyone now. The businessman across the aisle, the young woman pretending to read, the older couple who had been focused on their glasses of champagne, their postures stiffened, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes followed him. Caroline was still standing in the aisle, her arms stiff at her sides, her breath coming in shallow pulls. She didn't move right away, as if sensing, without fully understanding, that something was wrong, that something was shifting in a way she couldn't control. Walter reached the last row of first class and stepped into the narrow aisle of economy, the seats suddenly closer together, the space more confined, a sharp contrast to what he had just left behind. He lowered himself into an empty seat, his fingers unclenching from the strap of his bag as he placed it carefully by his feet. His hands rested lightly on his lap, but there was an unmistakable tension in his fingers, in the way his thumbs rubbed against each other, in the way his jaw set just a little tighter than before. He had been here before. Not here, on this plane, but here, in this feeling, in this moment of being made to move, of being told without words that he didn't belong. He had been here, in restaurants, in meetings, in hotel lobbies, in places where the world expected him to shrink, to accept the unspoken rules that had been stitched into the fabric of his existence. He exhaled slowly, the anger in his chest controlled, but undeniable. A soft vibration in his pocket. He pulled out his phone again. A single response. We're on it. Walter's lips pressed together, his grip tightening around the phone just slightly before he set it down beside him. This wasn't over. Not even close. Caroline adjusted her uniform, smoothing out invisible wrinkles as she exhaled through her nose. The tension she had felt earlier had started to fade. The situation was handled. It wasn't personal, just protocol, just ensuring order. That's what she told herself. She moved back through first class with purpose, her practiced smile back in place as she offered polite nods to passengers who barely looked at her. In her mind, everything had been settled. Walter Jennings was in economy where he should have been all along, and the first-class cabin was back to normal, filled with the type of passengers she was used to serving. Then, 5 minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. Miss Miller, report to the cockpit immediately. Caroline's smirk barely lasted a second before something in the pit of her stomach twisted. It wasn't common to be called to the cockpit, especially not in front of passengers, heads lifted slightly, curious expressions flickering across the faces of those who had been half listening. She swallowed, forcing herself to remain composed as she turned and walked toward the front of the plane. It's fine, probably just a routine check, maybe an update from the crew. She wasn't worried. But the moment she stepped inside, everything changed. The cockpit was small, dimly lit except for the glow of control panels, the quiet hum of machinery filling the space. The captain, Gregory Owens, turned in his seat slowly, his face unreadable. His co-pilot barely glanced at her, eyes fixed forward, but there was tension in the way he sat, in the stiffness of his shoulders. The real problem, however, wasn't either of them. It was the voice crackling through the in-flight phone mounted on the panel. Is she there? The voice was crisp, professional, but there was an edge to it. Caroline felt something cold trickle down her spine. The captain exhaled slowly, pressing the button to respond. Yes, she's here. Silence stretched for a beat too long. Then, the voice on the other end spoke again, colder this time. Miss Miller, we just received a direct call from corporate regarding an incident with a first-class passenger. We need an immediate explanation. Caroline's mouth went dry. She forced herself to clear her throat, keeping her tone even. Yes, sir, there was a gentleman sitting in first class. After reviewing his ticket, I believed there was a mistake, so I reassigned him to economy. More silence. Then the voice came back, sharper now. Did you verify his ticket through the system? Caroline felt a bead of sweat at the base of her neck. Her fingers twitched slightly before she clasped them together in front of her. She had checked it, but not properly. She had looked at it, but she had already decided before she even read it. Her hesitation was answer enough. The voice on the other end didn't wait for her to recover. Did you confirm with the gate agent before removing him from his seat? Her throat felt tight. No, sir. A slow exhale, deliberate and heavy. Miss Miller, do you even know who that man is? For the first time since stepping into the cockpit, uncertainty flickered across her face. No, sir, she admitted, her voice quieter now. The captain turned fully in his seat, his expression grim. His name is Walter Jennings, he said, watching as her face remained blank for only a second before the realization hit. Not only is he a long-time first-class traveler with his airline, but his grandson is a corporate partner. Caroline's stomach plummeted. The voice on the phone pressed forward, relentless. You didn't just remove a passenger, Miss Miller. You humiliated someone with significant influence over this airline. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. The captain's gaze hardened. "We have been given direct instructions from corporate," he said, voice steady. "You will return to Mr. Jennings, personally apologize, and escort him back to first class, in front of every passenger." The final blow came seconds later. "And when this flight lands, you will report directly to the executive office. Your employment status will be reviewed immediately." The words crushed her like a hammer to the chest. She had never been spoken to like this before, not by a captain, not by corporate, not by anyone. She had made snap judgments in the past, had handled passengers the way she saw fit, but never had it come back to her like this. Never had she been questioned like this. The line clicked off with a sharp finality. The silence that followed was deafening. The captain gave her one last look before turning back to his controls. "Fix your mistake." Her legs felt heavy as she turned and walked out of the cockpit. She wasn't sure what was worse, the humiliation of what she was about to do, or the fact that it was about to happen in front of everyone. Caroline stood frozen just inside the cockpit, the confined space suddenly feeling smaller, the air thinner. The weight of what had just been said pressed against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She had expected a routine discussion, maybe a reminder about protocol, but this was something else entirely. The captain sat rigid in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression a mask of control, but his eyes held the kind of disappointment that made her stomach churn. The co-pilot avoided looking at her altogether, his gaze locked on the instrument panel as if he wanted nothing to do with what was happening. And then, from the small overhead speaker, the voice that sent ice through her veins returned, more measured this time, but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "Miss Miller," the man said, calm, deliberate, "dangerous." She recognized his name the moment the captain had said it. James O'Connell, senior corporate executive, someone whose decisions shaped careers, and more importantly, ended them. She had seen emails from him, had even sat through one of his virtual training sessions years ago. He was a name that held power, but she had never imagined she would be speaking to him directly. He didn't waste time. "You realize what you've done?" Caroline's throat tightened. Her tongue felt thick in her mouth. This was her chance, her opportunity to explain, to salvage the situation, to say something that would reverse the sinking feeling in her gut. She forced her voice to remain steady. "Sir, you just removed a VIP traveler from his paid first-class seat," O'Connell cut her off. "And his grandson? He's an airline board member." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. Caroline's breath caught. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Hi," she tried again, but nothing came out. The captain exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temples as if trying to contain his frustration. The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably in his seat, still avoiding eye contact. The only sound was the soft hum of the cockpit controls, the distant murmur of passengers beyond the locked door, the low rumble of the engines preparing for takeoff. James O'Connell let the silence stretch, giving her just enough time to feel the full weight of her mistake before he spoke again. "Tell me," he said, his voice still calm but sharpened now, cutting through the air like a blade. "Did you verify his ticket through the system before removing him?" Caroline's stomach twisted painfully. She had checked the ticket, but not really. She had seen it, had flipped it in her hands, but she had already made up her mind before she even looked at the details. She had assumed, and now she was paying for it. Her mouth opened, but before she could force out a lie, the truth was already there, raw and exposed. "No, sir," she admitted, her voice quieter now. The cockpit remained still, tense, judgment pressing in on her from all sides. "And did you confirm with the gate agent before telling him he needed to move?" O'Connell asked, his voice colder now, almost clinical. Caroline swallowed hard. "No, sir." A slow, heavy exhale came from the speaker. "Miss Miller," O'Connell said, and this time the warning in his voice was undeniable. "Do you even understand what this looks like?" Caroline's fingers curled into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to remain still. "It was a misunderstanding," she said quickly, too quickly. "I thought there had been an error." "An error," O'Connell repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. The captain turned toward her then, his expression darker than before. Or was it a choice? The words sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. Her skin burned. James O'Connell wasn't finished. "You removed an elderly black man from first class," he said slowly, enunciating every word, making sure she felt them, "without checking, without verifying. You humiliated him in front of a cabin full of passengers who now have their phones out." Caroline's breath hitched. Her eyes widened. "Faho, passengers." Recording. The realization struck like a hammer. How many people had seen, how many had been watching. O'Connell continued, merciless. "Before this flight even lands, this will be on social media. It will be in the news. Do you have any idea what kind of damage control we'll be dealing with because of your misunderstanding?" Caroline felt her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew the answer. None of this would be handled quietly. Not now, not anymore. "We have been given direct instructions from corporate," the captain said, voice flat, emotionless. "You will return to Mr. Jennings, personally apologize and escort him back to first class, in front of every passenger." Caroline's chest tightened, panic rising like bile in her throat. The humiliation, the sheer unbearable weight of what she was about to do. And O'Connell's voice came through again, delivering the final blow. "When this flight lands, you will report directly to the executive office. Your employment status is under immediate review." The floor beneath her felt like it was tilting.
She had heard those words before. She had seen what happened to employees whose status was under review. It wasn't a review at all. It was a decision already made. Her career was over. She was going to lose everything. The line clicked dead.
Silence. Then the captain, without even looking at her, repeated, "Fix your mistake." Her hands clenched at her sides. Her legs felt weak. Every step back to the first-class cabin would feel like a walk to the gallows. And worst of all, she deserved it. Caroline's fingers felt numb as she gripped the edge of the cockpit door, her heart hammering so loudly she swore the captain and co-pilot could hear it. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like an avalanche. Her mind was scrambling for a way out, an excuse, a justification, anything that could undo the last 10 minutes of her life. But there was nothing. She had made a mistake, a career-ending mistake.
She felt the captain's gaze burning into her, but she couldn't look at him. She knew if she did, she'd see exactly what she didn't want to face. Disgust, disappointment, a verdict already passed before the plane had even landed.
Her stomach twisted violently. "Miss Miller." Her head snapped up. The captain's voice was quieter now, but it carried more weight than it had before. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Her throat felt tight. She swallowed against the dryness, willing her voice to come out steady. "Yes, sir." The words tasted foreign, almost unnatural. "Then you know what you have to do." Caroline inhaled sharply, her fingers curling at her sides. She knew. She had to go back out there. She had to walk down that aisle past every single passenger who had seen her, force that man out of his rightful seat. She had to approach Walter Jennings, the man she had humiliated, the man whose grandson had the power to erase her career with a single phone call, and apologize. And she had to do it in front of everyone. Her pride screamed against it. Every fiber of her being wanted to run, to hide, to find some way to spin this, to turn it into something other than what it was. But there was no running from this. The voice from corporate had been clear. This wasn't just about one passenger. This was about the entire airline. This was about their reputation, their image, their response to what she had done. And now all eyes were on her. She forced herself to step back into the main cabin.
The moment she did, the air shifted.
She felt it before she even took her first step down the aisle. Passengers who had been engaged in quiet conversations stilled. The ones who had been pretending not to watch earlier weren't pretending anymore. A businessman in the first row of economy slowly lowered his newspaper. A woman near the aisle leaned slightly forward, pretending to adjust her tray table but watching everything. Carolyn's skin burned under the weight of their silent judgment. She straightened her uniform, lifting her chin just slightly, trying to maintain some shred of control, but it was slipping through her fingers faster than she could hold on to it. She had spent years commanding the cabin with authority, years ensuring things went smoothly, that she was the one in control. But now, as she walked toward the economy section, she had never felt smaller. Walter Jennings was exactly where she had left him. His hands rested on his lap, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or flipping through the book in his lap. He was waiting, and somehow that made it worse. Caroline stopped just beside his row, her hands clasped in front of her, her voice catching in her throat. She had never had to do this before. Not like this. "Sir," she started, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. Walter looked up at her, and she froze. His gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't triumphant. It was something worse. It was patient, measured, knowing, like he had already seen how this would play out long before she had. Her throat tightened. "There's been a misunderstanding." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Someone let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff. Walter didn't move. He just studied her, his gaze calm but sharp. She swallowed hard, pushing forward. "I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." A long beat of silence. Walter closed the book in his lap, placing it carefully on the tray table in front of him. Then, slowly, he lifted his eyes to hers and tilted his head slightly. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged with something sharp. Caroline hesitated. She felt the cabin listening, felt the attention pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. "Yes," she said finally. "There was an error in seating." Walter exhaled softly through his nose, shaking his head just slightly. "An error," he repeated, "or a choice." A ripple of tension spread through the cabin. A few passengers glanced at each other, some pretending to shift in their seats, others staring outright. They all knew the answer. Carolyn's stomach twisted painfully. She had nothing to say. Nothing that wouldn't make it worse. Walter held her gaze for another long, agonizing moment before he finally moved. He reached for his bag, lifting it carefully, methodically, not rushed, not hurried. He wasn't just moving seats. He was reclaiming something she had tried to take from him. And she felt it. She felt it in the way every single step he took back to first class was silent but louder than anything she could have said. She followed him, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides, her pulse hammering as she passed passenger after passenger who refused to look away. By the time they reached first class, the space felt different. Walter sat down, slowly, deliberately. He adjusted his blazer, settled his bag beside him, then lifted his eyes back to hers. For the first time since she had started working for this airline, Caroline had no control. If she had thought this would be over the moment he sat down, she was wrong. Because the way he looked at her, the way the passengers around them watched, judging silently, told her exactly what she didn't want to hear. She could apologize. She could try to make it right. But some things weren't so easily erased. She forced a breath and tried one last time. "If there's anything you need," she said, voice quieter now, almost weak, "please let me know." Walter didn't answer right away. He reached for his seatbelt, buckling it carefully. Then, and only then, did he tilt his head slightly and meet her gaze one last time. "You didn't ask me that when I first sat down." The words weren't loud, but they hit harder than anything corporate could have said. And in that moment, Caroline realized something she had never truly understood before. She had spent her career deciding who deserved first class. Now, she wasn't even on his level. Caroline turned away from Walter, her face burning, her pulse pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to move quickly to escape the unbearable weight of his words, but her legs refused to cooperate. She took her first step, then another, but it felt like she was walking through deep water, every movement sluggish, every second stretching longer than it should. The first-class cabin, which had always been her domain, now felt foreign. It wasn't hers anymore. It never had been. Passengers didn't try to hide their stares now. Some looked at her openly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes flickering between her and Walter. The woman who had been clutching her mimosa earlier now held the glass in both hands, staring at the golden liquid as if searching for something to say. The businessman across the aisle, the one who had barely spared Walter a glance before, adjusted his tie, his face tight with something between discomfort and guilt. Caroline could feel it. The shift in power. She had walked through this cabin thousands of times before, dictating the rules, controlling the space, but now she wasn't the one enforcing authority. She wasn't the one deciding who belonged. They were. The passengers, silent but present, were watching her, judging her. She passed the dividing curtain between first class and economy, and if she had thought the weight would ease, she was wrong. The walk back to the galley felt longer than it should have. It felt endless. Passengers in economy had seen it happen too. Some had only caught fragments of the moment, others had been watching from the start. A man near the front of the section shook his head slightly, muttering something under his breath to the woman beside him. She didn't respond, just pressed her lips together and stared straight ahead. Caroline forced herself to keep walking. She needed to get to the galley, to escape, to breathe. She could still feel it. The weight, not just of their eyes, but of the truth. She had spent her entire career believing she knew how to handle people, how to maintain control, but she hadn't controlled anything today. And the worst part? She never would again. Caroline's throat felt dry as she forced herself to take a slow breath. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to disappear, to somehow undo the past 30 minutes. But there was no escape. No way to rewrite what had already happened. She stood beside Walter, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Her voice felt foreign, unfamiliar, as she finally spoke the words she had been dreading. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding." The moment the words left her mouth, the energy in the cabin shifted. The low hum of conversation in first class vanished. The soft clinking of glasses, the rustling of pages from business journals, the occasional clearing of throats, all of it stopped. Everyone was listening. Walter finally looked up at her. His movements were slow, deliberate, his eyes steady and piercing locked onto hers, and Caroline felt it, the weight of his silence, the power behind it. For the first time in her career, she had no control over this moment. Was it a mistake? Walter asked, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. Or was it a choice? A ripple of tension spread through the cabin. Someone exhaled sharply. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly fascinated with his watch. The woman with the mimosa, who had been sipping her drink casually earlier, now clutched the glass with both hands, her knuckles white. Caroline's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak right away. She couldn't, because she knew, they all knew, the answer. Her stomach twisted painfully. The words sat on the edge of her tongue, but she wasn't sure how to say them in a way that wouldn't destroy whatever dignity she had left. Walter didn't rush her. They didn't need to. His question had already done what no corporate reprimand ever could. It had exposed her. She had walked through this cabin just moments ago, confident, certain, believing she had the authority to decide who belonged here. But now, standing in front of him, she wasn't the one in control anymore. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. It was a mistake. Walter tilted his head slightly. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes, something that told her he wasn't going to let her off that easily. Caroline's fingers curled slightly at her sides. She wanted this to be over. She wanted to turn away, to retreat into the galley, to disappear into the routine of serving drinks and pretending this had never happened. But Walter wasn't letting her go that easily. And neither was the cabin. The silence stretched so long that she felt suffocated by it. "I misjudged you," she said finally, forcing the words out, the taste bitter in her mouth. Walter let the words sit in the air, making sure she felt them, making sure everyone in the cabin felt them. A man in the third row exhaled through his nose, his arms crossed over his chest. Another passenger, a younger woman in a sleek business suit, lifted her phone ever so slightly, pretending to check her messages but clearly recording. They were all witnessing it. Her humiliation, her downfall. And somehow, that still wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that she deserved it. Walter inhaled slowly before nodding once, as if that was all the answer he needed. Then, without another word, he reached for his bag, lifting it with careful hands, moving deliberately, unhurried. He didn't rush back to first class. He didn't let her dictate the pace anymore. Every step he took was his own. And as she followed behind him, she realized the truth. She had spent her career deciding who was worthy of first class. But today, she had learned what it felt like to be the one left behind. Walter lifted his bag with steady hands, adjusting the strap over his shoulder, his movements slow, deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't just walking back to his seat, he was reclaiming it. And every step he took carried the weight of that truth. The aisle was silent, so silent it felt unnatural. The quiet hum of the plane's engines was the only sound filling the space, and yet the energy in the cabin was thick, suffocating. Walter didn't need to look around to know that every single person was watching. They weren't watching him the way they had before when he had first entered the first-class cabin and sat down in seat 3A, minding his own business. Back then, he had been invisible. Now he was impossible to ignore. A businessman 2 rows ahead sat stiffly in his seat, eyes locked on the tray table in front of him, as if suddenly fascinated by its existence. The woman with the mimosa shifted slightly, staring into her half-empty glass like she could disappear inside it. Another man, the one who had been flipping through a newspaper earlier, had set it down completely, his fingers lightly gripping the armrests as his gaze flickered toward Walter before darting away again. Shame hung in the air like a thick fog, because they had all seen what happened. They had all watched him be humiliated, and none of them had spoken up. Walter didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The silence surrounding him was enough. It spoke louder than any words could. His shoes pressed against the soft carpet as he walked, the narrow aisles stretching before him. But he took his time, because he wasn't the one who should feel rushed. That belonged to her. Caroline stood frozen in place, still gripping her hands in front of her, her chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. But her face told the real story. Her eyes were downcast, avoiding his gaze. Her posture, once upright and commanding, had lost its sharpness. She looked small. Walter didn't stop. He passed by her, stepping into the first-class section, his back straight, his pace steady, and with every step the power shifted further. By the time he reached his seat, the air felt different. It wasn't just a chair, it wasn't just a ticket, it was something more. He had been denied his place, and now he was taking it back. Walter lowered himself into seat 3A. He adjusted his blazer. He reached for his seatbelt, buckling it with calm, deliberate fingers. Then, finally, he lifted his gaze back to her. Caroline swallowed hard, still standing in the aisle, still trapped in the moment she had created. For the first time in her career, she was the one who didn't belong. Caroline barely made it back to the galley before her legs threatened to give out beneath her. Her breathing was shallow, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too suffocating. The weight of the last hour clung to her like a second skin. She could still feel the stares of the passengers, their unspoken judgment pressing into her back like 1,000 invisible knives. They had watched everything, the mistake, the humiliation, the power shift. She had once commanded this space, dictated the rules, controlled who belonged where. But now, she was the one shrinking. Then the phone rang. The sound sliced through the thick silence of the galley like a blade. Caroline's stomach twisted violently. She already knew who it would be. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the receiver, pressing it to her ear with a stiff grip. "This is Miss Miller," she said, though her voice sounded hollow, distant. A slow breath came from the other end of the line before a voice spoke, deep, controlled, dangerous in its calmness. "Miss Miller, this is Dominic Carter." Caroline felt her heart drop. She knew that name. Everyone in the airline industry did. Dominic Carter wasn't just an executive. He was the executive. Senior Vice President of Operations, one of the most powerful figures in the company, the man who made decisions that reshaped entire careers with a single phone call. And now he was calling her. "We need to discuss your employment," he continued, his tone even, giving nothing away. Caroline's breath caught. The air in the galley felt thicker, heavier. "I understand," she forced out, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. A pause, then his voice sharpened. "No, Miss Miller, I don't think you do." She swallowed hard. Beyond, the galley passengers were still watching her. Some were pretending not to, flipping through magazines, checking their phones. But she could feel their eyes lingering, could hear the faint whispers. They knew. They all knew. Dominic exhaled through the phone, the kind of exhale that carried finality. "We've reviewed the incident," he said, his words clipped, precise. "And the footage." Caroline's blood ran cold. The footage. Someone had recorded it. Of course they had. She had been so focused on Walter Jennings, so blinded by her own certainty, that she hadn't realized it was a different kind of power that had turned against her. Not Walter's, not corporates, the passengers. The moment she had doubted him, dismissed him, humiliated him, it had been captured. And now it was evidence. She felt like she might be sick. Dominic's voice remained steady. "The video is already circulating online," he continued. "We've received direct contact from multiple high-level executives, some of whom, I should remind you, answer to Walter Jennings' grandson." Caroline closed her eyes for a second, but it didn't help. The walls were closing in. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" She opened her mouth, desperate to grasp at some kind of defense, some justification, some excuse that would make this less damning. But there was nothing. Because there was no excuse. Because she had done this. Because they all knew why. She had never felt more exposed. Her fingers curled against the counter as she inhaled shakily. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. A long pause. Then Dominic Carter spoke again, his voice colder than before. "Miss Miller, effective immediately, your employment with this airline is under termination review." Her body locked up. Terminate. The word hit her like a physical blow. She had expected a reprimand, a suspension, but not this. Not this fast. Not this public. Not like this. She sucked in a breath, trying to hold on to whatever composure she had left. "Sir, Dominic cut her off. "This is not a discussion. Security will be waiting for you when the plane lands. You will turn in your badge, your ID, and any company-issued materials." Her nails dug into her palm. They weren't even letting her walk out of the airport on her own. They were making an example out of her, just like she had tried to make an example out of Walter Jennings. She felt the irony like a slap. Dominic's voice turned final. "Do you understand?" Caroline felt her breath shudder. She could barely speak. "Yes," she whispered. The line went dead. She lowered the phone slowly, her hand trembling. Her career, her entire life had just collapsed. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Caroline stood in the galley, her body numb, her mind spinning. The phone call had ended, but the weight of Dominic Carter's words still crushed her. Fired. The word replayed over and over in her head, louder than the hum of the engines, louder than the murmurs of passengers still whispering about what had happened. She inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself, but the second she stepped forward, she caught a glimpse through the narrow gap between the galley curtains, a flash of a phone screen. Passengers were still watching her. And worse, they were recording. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't thought about it before, too wrapped up in the moment, too focused on Walter Jennings, on defending herself, on clinging to the last shreds of authority she thought she had. But now, standing there, she could see them. A young woman in a sharp business suit had her phone tilted just enough to capture her. A man 2 rows ahead wasn't even trying to hide it, holding his phone in front of his chest, his fingers scrolling, probably checking to see if the video had already spread. Caroline's breath hitched. Of course it had. The world moved fast now. She had seen stories like this before. Employees caught mistreating customers, videos going viral, outrage spreading like wildfire. She had always assumed she was different, that she was smarter, more careful. But now, she wasn't the one watching from the sidelines. She was the headline. A vibration in her pocket sent a fresh wave of dread through her. She pulled out her phone with stiff fingers. A single notification stared back at her from the screen. Anonymous user, just saw a video of you. Wow. Her blood ran cold. Her fingers moved on autopilot, unlocking the phone, her breath catching as she pulled up her social media feeds. Her name was trending. She clicked on the first post she saw, and there it was. A video of her standing over Walter Jennings, arms crossed, expression hard, as she told him to move. She barely recognized herself. She had looked so certain, so unyielding. And then the second video started playing, the one where she had been forced to walk back down the aisle to apologize, to escort him back to his seat like a prisoner leading her own execution. She scrolled further. The comments were pouring in by the second. This woman just got fired mid-flight. Iconic. The way Walter Jennings walked back to first class like a king. She deserved every second of that humiliation. You can see the moment she realizes she's done for, damn. Her chest tightened, her vision blurring. This wasn't just an internal investigation. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was public, and it was unstoppable. Passengers were still whispering as she stood there, scrolling through the destruction of her own life in real time. Some looked away when she glanced up, but others didn't even bother to pretend. A man near the front smirked slightly, shaking his head. "Bet you didn't see that coming." His seatmate chuckled, fired before the plane even touched the ground. Caroline gritted her teeth, her fingers tightening around her phone. It wasn't supposed to end like this, but it had, and there was no undoing it. The moment the plane touched the ground, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the cabin. Seatbelts clicked open, passengers stretched, conversation started up again, but the tension that had settled over the flight still lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. People knew what had happened, and more importantly, they knew who had won. Walter remained seated, his hands resting on his lap, his fingers gently tapping against the armrest as he waited. He had no reason to rush. He had nothing to prove. But Caroline, she was nowhere to be seen. Walter imagined she was still in the galley, trying to disappear, trying to convince herself this wasn't happening, that maybe when she stepped off the plane, she would wake up and find out this was all a bad dream. But reality had already closed in around her, just as it always had for people like him when they had been forced to accept the world's judgment without a fight. The difference this time? The judgment hadn't fallen on him. The intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at our destination. Please remain seated until the cabin crew has cleared you for deplaning." A slow, measured breath passed through Walter's lips as he reached down, lifting his bag with practiced ease. He had been in difficult situations before. He had known the sting of injustice, had swallowed down his own pride more times than he could count. But today had been different. Today, he hadn't had to fight. The truth had fought for him. He stood, stretching his legs slightly before stepping into the aisle. Passengers who had been silent before now stole quick glances at him, some with quiet admiration, others with unease. A few even nodded subtly, as if trying to make up for their earlier silence. He didn't need their approval. He never had. The walk toward the exit was slow, not because he hesitated, but because he took his time. because it was his time now. And then finally, he stepped off the plane. The terminal was buzzing with movement, families greeting loved ones, business travelers moving with purpose, airport employees guiding passengers toward their next gates. The world continued, unaffected by what had just happened on Flight 562. But Walter's world? It had already shifted. And standing near the gate, waiting for him with a knowing smile, was his grandson. Jonathan Jennings, dressed in a crisp navy suit, his hands in his pockets, watching everything. Walter smiled softly. Jonathan chuckled as his grandfather approached. "You didn't even have to fight this time, Grandpa." Walter met his grandson's gaze, pride and wisdom reflected in his eyes. "No, son," he said quietly. "The truth fought for me." And with that, they turned and walked away, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Caroline's breath was shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the galley counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The world around her felt muted, distant, like she was watching her own downfall from the outside. The murmurs of passengers deplaning, the rustling of bags being pulled from overhead bins, the polite thank yous exchanged between flight attendants and travelers, it all blurred together into meaningless noise. Then, footsteps. Heavy, purposeful, unavoidable. She didn't need to turn around to know who they belonged to. A shadow fell over her. "Ms. Miller," a deep voice said, "you need to come with us." Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned. Two security officers stood in the narrow galley entrance, their expressions unreadable, their presence undeniable. This was it. This was the moment. The moment she had unknowingly created the second she had looked at Walter Jennings and decided he didn't belong. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, to fight, but what was left to say? Passengers were still moving down the aisle, some pretending not to notice, others openly watching. She could feel their gazes burning into her, a mix of curiosity, judgment, and something worse, indifference. Not long ago, she had walked through this cabin with authority, dictating who sat where, deciding who belonged. Now she didn't even belong on the plane. One of the officers gestured toward the exit. "Let's go." Her legs felt leaden as she stepped forward, every movement slow, mechanical. The once familiar first-class cabin, her domain, her territory, felt foreign now, hostile. As she moved past the rows of seats, she caught sight of Walter's now empty chair. It was neat, pristine, as if nothing had ever happened. But something had, and it had changed everything. The flight crew avoided her gaze as she stepped into the jet bridge. The cold, artificial light of the terminal hit her like a slap. And then there he was, Dominic Carter, standing near the gate, arms crossed, expression cold and unreadable. Caroline's throat tightened. She knew better than to speak first. He let the silence stretch, let her feel every agonizing second before he finally exhaled and shook his head. "Let's make this quick," he said. The officers flanked her as they walked through the terminal, past bustling travelers who had no idea they were witnessing the end of her career. Caroline didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't plead, because it wouldn't have mattered.